Hello, I'm Charlotte Enns, and I'm the president and chair of Northern Science Research, and also a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. And I'd like to tell you about our ASL assessment tools. First, I'd like to introduce the team, because I am a hearing researcher, but I work with deaf research assistants, specifically Sarah Rabu, Kyra Zimmer, and Cheryl Broseat. Together, we have developed 2 ASL assessments, the ASL Receptive Skills Test and the ASL Expressive Skills Test. I do want to acknowledge all the children, families, and schools who participated in our testing. And I also want to acknowledge the authors of the BSL, the British Sign Language tests. In particular, lead author Dr. Rosalind Herman from City University in London. Okay, let's start with the ASL Receptive Skills Test. This is a standardized test, which means that it's a formal measure which has some advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage is that we don't have very many standardized tests for ASL. And so this allows a comparison of how the child that you're testing is doing in comparison with typical development of ASL. Gives you some age-appropriate assessment. And that's also part of the second point, that the ASL Receptive Skills Test is norm referenced. We tested 203 deaf children, 77 had deaf parents, were native, and 126 were non-native, but they had early exposure to ASL, so before the age of 3. The ASL Receptive Skills Test is obviously a receptive test. That means it assesses a child's understanding or comprehension of ASL, not their use or their signing. It also focuses specifically on grammar, morphology, or the ways that signs are modified to change meaning, and syntax, how signs are put together into phrases and sentences. As I said, the ASL Receptive Skills Test is adapted from the British Sign Language Test, and it is commercially available on the Northern Science Research website. So, more specifically, the ASL RST, as we abbreviate it, takes about 15 minutes to administer. It involves the child watching the video recorded ASL sentences and then selecting a picture to match the sentence, the meaning of that sentence, from an array of 4 pictures. The test package itself includes a vocabulary check with 20 picture cards, 3 practice items where you make sure the child understands how to do the task before the test begins, and then 42 test items. The items test 8 different ASL grammar categories. Number 1, number distribution. For example, if you set up 3 cups on a table, how many there are and how they're set up, that arrangement. That's an example of number and distribution. Number 2, negation. This can be either a head shake that's used with a sign, or it can be an actual negative sign. So for example, not sleeping, that's just incorporating the head shake, or nothing, never. Those are negative signs. Number 3, noun-verb distinctions. Signs that are similar in how they're signed, but the movement is changed slightly to indicate a noun versus a verb. So for example, chair versus sit. Spatial verbs. These are called different things, but in different ASL linguistic descriptions, but we've referred to them as spatial verbs. Often they use classifiers to indicate locations of objects. So if there's a car beside a house, you would indicate the house and then the car with the classifier. Or there may be some action involved, like riding a bike over a hill. And you would indicate that with the classifier and a movement. Then we also have size and shape specifiers. For example, to show a checkered shirt. Handling classifiers, how you hold objects. For example, holding a brush to brush your hair. There may be conditional sentences. For example, using the ASL sign if or suppose, and then indicating what the dependent clause is. So an example is, if it rains, the game will be canceled. And then finally, role shift is assessed, where the different roles of the characters are taken on by the speaker to show that change that in interaction. So example, one character might be tapping someone on the shoulder, and then you shift into the role of the person being tapped and show how they turn around in response to that tap. So those are the different grammar structures that are tested. And again, it's the child's understanding of that grammar. So as I said, there is a vocabulary check. And the reason for this is to ensure that the child that you're testing knows the vocabulary or knows the signs that are used in the test. And that way, when the child responds incorrectly to an item, you know that, or you can assume that, they don't understand the grammar structure involved, not that they don't understand the signs. So all the signs that are used in the test sentences are very familiar, basic kinds of signs for young children to know. And we've also tried to control that they don't have a lot of regional variations, so they'd be recognized across North America. Now, you don't have to give the vocabulary check if you're sure that the child knows the vocabulary, knows those 20 signs. And so often that means if they're older than 6 years of age, the vocabulary check isn't needed. Here's an example of what it looks like to give the vocabulary check. You just have the child name the items. So you can see it's a pretty quick and easy check of whether the child knows the signs. And you can do it both with them naming the pictures or pointing to the pictures. Either way, it's just naming is often faster to administer. Okay, so what do you do when you give the test? You need, all the equipment you need is the test USB and obviously a computer to play the video on. A copy of the score sheet, and a pencil or some way of marking it. The test is administered one-to-one, one child with a tester, and the child just points to the screen to indicate their response, and then the tester records that response on the score sheet. Again, the child must know the vocabulary, so if they get less than 15 out of 20 on the vocabulary check, you don't give the test. Or if they are unable to respond correctly to the practice items where you can give them some feedback, they don't seem to understand the test task, then don't go ahead and give the test. They're not ready for it. However, if they do know the vocabulary and they understand the practice items, then you can go ahead and administer the test. There's no time limit for items. You can pause in between to give them time to look at all the pictures and respond. And however, if the child gets 4 consecutive incorrect responses, then you stop the test. Then you've reached the ceiling. You can assume that they will get the rest of the items incorrect. So once you finish the test, you convert the standards, the raw scores, so the total number that they get right out of 42, to a standard score, which then allows you to compare to what is above or below average for their age. Standard scores are set up so that 100 is the mean, is the average, and then the range around that mean from 85 to 115 indicates the normal range or the average range. And then below 85 is below average, and even lower, below 70 is significantly delayed or below average. And then above 115 is above average, doing very well. So that allows you to compare the child's score to other children their age. I'll just show an example of the test items. And again, these can be paused when the pictures come up so the child can take as long as they need to select the right picture. Okay, that's ASL Receptive Skills. So what is the ASL Expressive Skills Test? It too is a formal test, meaning that it's norm referenced and there's a standardized way of giving it, and that it is very focused on assessing particular areas of language, in this case of ASL, production, narrative, grammar. It is a test for testing children's development of ASL, specifically children aged 4 to 13 years. And it measures narrative skills and parts of ASL grammar. And it uses an elicited language sample. So we use a video to get the child to tell a story, and that story is analyzed. It's important to note that you must be certified to use the ASL Expressive Skills Test. That means you must be fluent in ASL, preferably a native user of ASL, or a deaf person, and you must have taken our training workshop to know how to score the test consistently. Again, the ASL Expressive Skills Test is also based on the British Sign Language version of the test. It's called the British Sign Language Production Test. And, but with the ASL version, we created 3 videos to elicit stories from the children. Whereas the BSL, yes, we used the original spider story for that test, but we also developed 2 other parallel stories so that you can alternate between the stories when testing a child over time. So one year they can do the spider story, the next year they can do a different story, one we've called Home Alone, let's say, and you can still compare their scores because these are parallel in terms of the number of characters, the number of events, the grammatical structures that they elicit. And then also, we revised some of the scoring. We combined the narrative content and narrative structure into one system, and we gave more points towards role shift because we feel that role shift is a very key part of ASL development, particularly more complex ASL. And then, of course, in order to make the adaptations to the test, we conferred with ASL linguists and teachers and numerous rounds of pilot testing to finalize the actual scoring system. So the norms, the children that you're comparing to in the expressive test are based on 215 children, again, between the ages of 4 to 14 years. They weren't totally balanced in terms of boys and girls, 125 girls and 90 boys. But again, all of the children had strong early exposure to ASL before the age of 3. 144 were from deaf families, had at least one deaf parent, and 71 were from non-deaf families. And also all the children had non-verbal IQ in the normal range. We collected all the data from Schools for the Deaf across Canada and the US. And you may wonder why we have chosen this as our normative group, because we know that it's not truly representative of all deaf children. There's a lot more variation in young deaf children. But we wanted to have a comparison group that shows what is possible, what children are capable of when they have access to language, rather than showing, what delays they might have because of no fault of their own, not having the opportunity to learn language. So when children have early exposure, when they have the cognitive ability to learn language, then this is the group that you're comparing them to. And we want to have high expectations for all deaf children to acquire a good language foundation in ASL. So what does the test involve? The child watches a short video. It's about 3 minutes long, but it doesn't have any signing or any talking in it. It's just a story acted out with 2 characters, 2 deaf children. The child retells the story to a fluent signer who has not seen the video, or if the child thinks hasn't seen it. And the reason for that is to make sure that they tell it in a lot of detail. So following the retelling of the story, the child also answers 3 questions about the video. And then the child's story in ASL and the answers to the questions are all video recorded. And then the tester analyzes the ASL grammar and narrative, and the child's score is compared to norms to assess the overall level and areas of strength and weakness. I just want to explain briefly why narrative is an important area to assess language and how it benefits to assess narrative development in terms of understanding a child's overall expressive language abilities. Narrative is a very complex concept in terms of expressing, and it develops over a long period of time. And it requires good communication with adults about key events. It requires exposure to stories that are either told by adults or from books. And it requires participation in imaginative play. So really good early language stimulation kinds of activities. And narrative skills are also very strongly linked to later literacy development and educational progress. So assessing a narrative task will allow you to see the kinds of language skills in-depth that a child possesses and where they are in the development of those skills. So in the test itself, the content, the sequence, and the structure of the narrative are assessed. So the content simply meaning the, conveying the story in the events that happen. The sequence, making sure the story is told in order, in the right, in the way that it was initially experienced. And then the structure is how that narrative is put together. More specifically, the test uses what's called a high point analysis of structure, which includes the setting, so the people, the characters that are in the story, the initiating events, what sort of starts the action, then the series of complicating actions, events that sort of lead up to the climax or the high point, the main event of the story, or the problem maybe, and then how that's resolved, the resolution. And then often evaluation is part of that. Evaluation meaning both how the child feels about the story or how the characters might be feeling. So some being in tune with the feelings involved from experiencing that event. So these are all parts of the analysis for the ASL Expressive Skills Test. Then, as mentioned, the test also looks at very specific grammar structures in ASL, including spatial verbs. So again, those are the ways that people and objects, where they're located and how they move and how they interact. And spatial verbs involve using classifiers to indicate or depict those objects and people and characters and their motions. Then we also look at directional verbs, which are tied to agreement verbs. So directional and agreement verbs, where a certain action is towards a particular or with a particular person, and it has to be shown to move in that direction, and both the correct direction and the way that the storyteller sets up the space needs to be aligned. Aspect refers to timing, so how quickly or slowly, or if actions are interrupted. So those are all marked in the way things are signed. And then manner shows how an action is performed, whether it's done carefully or in a secret way or in a very bold way. That's all part of the manner. And then role shift is a very key part of ASL grammar, where the depiction of the characters and the interaction between the characters is conveyed by the narrator taking on those roles and showing the changing of roles within a story. So often that's important for dialogue, but also for other kinds of interaction between characters. All of those grammar structures are assessed and scored. So once the analysis of the child's story is completed, they get a set of scores in all these different categories. And those categories are then compared to the normative group, those raw scores, as we call them, to percentiles. It isn't a standard score, but it is a percentile based on a range of scores that is appropriate, or where in that distribution of scores the child's score falls. So for example, interpreting the percentile rankings goes from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile in these 5 categories. And again, the 10th percentile indicates a significant delay. This score would be where less than 10% of the normative group got that amount of points in that area. 25% or 25th percentile is moderately delayed. 50th percentile shows average or age-appropriate abilities, and a ranking at the 75th percentile is above average, and at the 90th percentile is significantly above average. And so in this way, the child's scoring around their ASL grammar, the use of role shift, their response to questions, and their use of narrative structure and content are all given a percentile ranking so that you can see a real analysis of their ability and comparison to norms. So, we think that the ASL Expressive Skills Test is very beneficial as a diagnostic tool because it accurately can determine strengths and areas of need for students, particularly students who are acquiring ASL late or have late exposure to ASL. Narrative skills are difficult to master, and so this test will really identify where they need to develop and the areas that are still lacking. Often narrative skills are poor or don't develop well when a child hasn't had exposure to good adult role models, language role models. And again, some of the key narrative features in ASL are conveyed through role shift, classifiers or spatial verbs, and verb agreement. And these are all the things that we assess in the test. So that's why we feel it is a good diagnostic tool and one that will be very beneficial in helping to determine how deaf children are developing in their expressive use of ASL. Thank you.